Welcome. This is Professor ELY Mustapha, and I invite you warmly to follow this deep dive on one of my white papers, Mauritania Dialogues, Lures and Glimmers. It's an interactive dialogue in English. Good listening.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're cutting straight to the heart of a crucial question about Mauritania's political scene. When the government offers dialogue to the opposition, is it a real step towards progress or something else entirely? You've shared with us ELY Mustapha's 2025 white paper, Dialogues, Illusions, and Glimmers, and it lays out a compelling argument that these dialogues might not be what they seem.
Right.
Our goal today is to dig into the historical evidence, see how Mauritania's experiences compare with other African nations, and use some key political theories to figure out if these dialogues are genuine or, well, a charade.
Yeah, and it's a really relevant question, isn't it? You see this pattern in lots of places.
We'll be looking at patterns from the era of military rule, the period of attempted transitions, and the more recent landscape under Ghazouani to understand the underlying dynamics.
Exactly. This white paper you've provided is a really detailed account, and what jumps out immediately is the central claim that despite decades of these dialogues, genuine political change just hasn't materialized.
Uh-huh.
Instead, the author suggests they've been a key tool for maintaining the existing power structure. Our task is to examine the historical trajectory presented here and see if it supports this assertion.
Okay, let's start by looking at the period from 1978 to 2005, which the white paper calls the era of military regimes and the monologue of force. It seems the author is arguing that any talk of national consultations during this time was basically for show. What's the core insight here?
Well, the core insight is that these national consultations, organized after the 1978 coup against Mokhtar al-Dadar, were less about genuine inclusion and more about solidifying the military's grip on power.
Right.
The white paper even points to alleged support from the Polisario Front and Algeria during the coup, hinting at motivations beyond just addressing the Western Sahara conflict. Crucially, these consultations reportedly excluded key civil leaders and representatives from the Afro-Mauritanian community.
Hey, really?
Yeah, a 1979 Amnesty International report apparently documented this exclusion, highlighting the lack of real inclusivity from the very beginning.
So it wasn't just about who was invited to the table, was it? The white paper implies that even the stated goals of these dialogues, like moving towards a more open political system, never actually materialized. What's a key example of this lack of follow-through?
A stark example is the bloody repression of a trade union strike in 1982. Despite any promises of reform coming out of these national consultations, the regime demonstrated its willingness to violently suppress dissent. It revealed the true limits of any supposed liberalization. This really underscores the idea that the talk of dialogue didn't translate into a fundamental shift in how power was exercised.
Okay.
Then we move into Mawiya Ould Taya's long rule, which the white paper frames through the lens of authoritarian democracy. What's the central idea behind this concept in the Mauritanian context?
We're looking at a system where the outward signs of democracy exist, like the multi-party system introduced after the 1991 referendum.
Yeah.
But the reality is that the PRDS party, essentially created to support Ould Taya, held all the real power.
Right, a dominant party system disguised as multipartyism.
Exactly. The author even brings up the 1992 elections, where Ould Taya won against Ahmed Ould Daddah with significant allegations of fraud.
Yeah.
What's the key insight about these early elections under this new system?
The key insight is that these elections, despite the appearance of democratic choice, were likely manipulated to maintain the ruling party's power, setting a pattern for future democratic exercises.
A pattern we see again and again.
Unfortunately, yes. What's fascinating, though, is how the white paper details the systematic repression of any real opposition during this period. Can you highlight some of the specific examples provided?
Yeah, we're talking about really serious stuff.
Yeah.
The forced expulsion of thousands of Afro-Mauritanians between 1989 and 1991. The horrific Ainul massacre in 1990, which Human Rights Watch documented.
Terrible.
And the targeting of Islamist and Republican opposition groups in the early 2000s, including the dissolution of the UFP and the arrest of Mohammed Al-Ghulam. It paints a picture of a regime actively silencing dissent while putting on a democratic face. And it seems even seemingly positive steps, like the 1986 agrarian reform and the creation of the National Human Rights Commission in 1993, are viewed with suspicion in the white paper. What's the author's argument about these initiatives?
Well, the white paper argues that these were largely superficial measures intended to project a positive image rather than enact real change. A 1987 World Bank report is apparently cited regarding the limitations of the agrarian reform.
Okay.
And a 1995 Amnesty International report raises concerns about the effectiveness and independence of the CNDH, the Human Rights Commission.
So window dressing, essentially.
That's the argument. The core insight here is that authoritarian regimes often adopt the trappings of democracy to gain legitimacy and international acceptance without making fundamental changes to their power structures.
Right, it makes sense.
This aligns with the idea that elections and reforms can serve as tools for external validation rather than genuine expressions of popular will. The white paper even references a 2003 EU election observation report noting significant irregularities, particularly in opposition strongholds, suggesting the primary goal was external legitimacy. The systematic censorship of media like Le Calme further reinforces this point.
It's interesting how the author contrasts this with Huntington's theory of democratic transitions, where elites might actually initiate reforms leading to democracy. Here, the white paper argues the military actively controlled and manipulated the process.
Exactly, a top-down manipulation rather than a genuine opening.
And it concludes this section by suggesting that even the 2005 coup, which some initially hoped would be a step forward, ultimately continued this authoritarian pattern, reducing dialogue to what the author calls an armed monologue.
Oof, strong words.
The moving into the period of 2005 to 2019 labeled aborted transitions, the era of democratic illusions. Does the white paper see any real shift in the nature of these dialogues?
The white paper argues that while this period saw more explicit attempts at democratic transition, the underlying authoritarian core persisted, and the dialogues continued to serve the interests of the regime.
So same strategy, different package.
Pretty much. The 2005 coup, while ending old Taya's long rule, is viewed as more of a reshuffling within the existing power structure. The subsequent technical dialogue in 2006, meant to prepare for elections, is criticized for excluding key opposition figures like Ahmed Ould-Daddah, as a 2007 IFES report apparently highlights. What's the significance of this exclusion?
Well, it suggests that even in a period supposedly aimed at democratic transition, the authorities were still controlling who had a voice, undermining the potential for genuine consensus and change right from the start.
Exactly.
And the 2007 elections, which the EU observed with apparent regularity, still resulted in a victory for Sidi Ould Sheikh Abdullahi, who, according to the white paper, was backed by the military establishment. The author even mentions some calling this an improved coup d'etat. What's the key takeaway here?
The key takeaway is that the formal trappings of democracy, like elections, can exist without a real transfer of power if the underlying power structures, in this case the military, remain in control. The white paper emphasizes the continued behind-the-scenes influence of the military even after the supposed transition. The 2008 coup by Mohamed Ould Abdelaziz and the subsequent Dakar dialogue in 2009 further illustrate this point.
Right, the Dakar dialogue.
While the Dakar Accord led to a national unity government and elections, the white paper argues, citing a 2009 ICG report, that its primary function was to legitimize Aziz internationally.
Ugh. The international angle again?
Yes. The rapid organization of elections without substantial electoral reform allowed Aziz to win through alleged clientelism and fraud, according to ECOWAS observers. So what's the core insight about the Dakar dialogue?
It seems the core insight is that even internationally mediated dialogues can be used by authoritarian regimes to gain legitimacy without necessarily committing to real democratic reforms. It's a performance for the outside world.
Precisely. Then we have the 2011-2012 National Dialogue, which followed the opposition's boycott of the 2013 legislative elections. This led to some seemingly progressive constitutional reforms, like the criminalization of slavery. But the white paper is quite skeptical, isn't it? What's the author's main criticism?
Yeah, very skeptical.
The author's main criticism is the significant gap between these legal changes and the reality on the ground. The 2016 Global Slavery Index apparently estimated a very high number of people still in slavery.
So,
And SOS Esclaves reported very few convictions for slavery during that period. The white paper references Catherine Wiley's work, highlighting how slavery became a political taboo but not a vanished socioeconomic reality.
so laws on paper but no teeth.
Essentially. This shows how legal reforms alone are insufficient without effective implementation and enforcement. What does this tell us about the nature of these dialogues and the resulting reforms?
It suggests that these dialogues can produce reforms that look good on paper, but don't necessarily translate into meaningful change in people's lives, potentially serving as a way to appease international pressure without disrupting the existing social order.
A way to manage perceptions.
And it seems Aziz had a specific strategy for managing the opposition, particularly the moderate Islamist party Tawassul. How did that play out?
The white paper discusses how Aziz legalized Tawassul in 2007 and allowed it to become the official opposition. The author argues this was a deliberate strategy to fragment the broader opposition and create a semblance of political pluralism.
Divide and conquer.
You got it. Tawassul, winning a relatively small percentage of parliamentary seats in 2018, further isolated more critical opposition voices. This whole period, the white paper contends, fits Heydman's theory of authoritarian resilience. What's the key idea behind this theory in the Mauritanian context?
The key idea seems to be that the regime was able to adapt and survive by strategically co-opting certain segments of the opposition, enacting symbolic reforms that didn't really threaten its core power, and gaining international legitimacy through these carefully managed processes. The dialogues, according to the author, were essentially safety valves that release some pressure without ever challenging the fundamental authoritarian system.
Right, letting off steam without fixing the engine.
Now that brings us to the most recent period covered, 2019 to 2023, which the white paper titles the Ghazouani era, the dialogue spectacle. What's the central argument here?
The white paper suggests that under Ghazouani, these patterns of dialogue as a tool of control have continued, perhaps with an even more polished and sophisticated approach.
More spectacle, less substance.
That's the implication. Ghazouani's initial promises of inclusive governance raised some expectations, but the subsequent national consultations are portrayed as having very limited real impact. Can you give some examples of these consultations and the author's analysis of them?
Sure. The author details initiatives like the 2020 Youth Assizes and the 2021 National Forums for Mauritanian Women, noting the significant participation in both. However, the white paper points out that key indicators like youth unemployment remained stubbornly high.
No real change, then.
And women's representation in decision-making bodies didn't significantly improve, citing a report from the AFCF. This raises a crucial question. What was the real purpose of these widely attended events?
Exactly. The white paper quotes Mauritanian political scientists who describe these sectoral consultations as essentially political theater.
Theater, yeah.
The core insight here is that they were designed to create the illusion of participation and address specific grievances without any genuine transfer of power or commitment to fundamental change. The 2023 National Reconciliation Assizes further exemplifies this, with the author highlighting Ghazouani's opening speech, but also noting the significant boycott by the opposition, signaling a lack of trust in the process. What does this boycott suggest?
It strongly suggests that at least a significant portion of the opposition views these dialogues as insincere and unlikely to lead to real progress, further supporting the white paper's thesis. They just don't buy it anymore.
Right, the trust isn't there. And the disconnect between the rhetoric of reconciliation and the actual government spending is quite revealing, isn't it?
Yeah, tell me about that.
The white paper points to a significant increase in military spending compared to a decrease in social spending in the 2024 budget, citing an IFRI note. What does this tell us about the regime's priorities?
Well, it strongly indicates that the regime's priority remains the maintenance of security and its own power, rather than addressing the underlying social and economic grievances that fuel political discontent. Actions speak louder than words, right?
Absolutely. It reinforces the idea that the talk of reconciliation through dialogue might be more about managing dissent than genuinely addressing its root causes. This is where the white paper connects Ghazouani's approach to Larry Diamond's concept of facade democracy. What's the key characteristic of this type of regime?
It's about maintaining the outward appearances of democratic processes, regular consultations, formal institutions, while the substance of democracy, like genuine power sharing and accountability, is absent.
All show, no go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The dialogues become tools for internal and external legitimization rather than real mechanisms for political change. The author even quotes Cedric Jourt on how contemporary authoritarian regimes use the language of democracy to reinforce their power, turning dialogue into a political spectacle without real decision-making power. So the Ghazouani era, according to the white paper, is characterized by what?
It's characterized by a more sophisticated political discourse around dialogue and reconciliation, but fundamentally without any real shifts in the underlying authoritarian system. The consultations, despite their public visibility, haven't resulted in significant structural changes in how the country is governed.
Okay, so the pattern continues, just maybe prettier.
Perhaps. Now, the white paper broadens its analysis by looking at African dialogues, tools for authoritarian perpetuation. What's the main argument in this comparative section?
The main argument is that Mauritania's experience isn't unique, and that across Africa, dialogues initiated by authorities can often serve to maintain authoritarian power rather than promote genuine democracy.
Right, it's a regional trend, not just a local one.
The author even starts with a striking quote from ELY Mustapha, framing African dialogues as laboratories where techniques of domination are perfected.
Ouch, that's a powerful quote.
It is. The white paper then presents case studies of Chad and the Democratic Republic of Congo to illustrate this point. Let's start with Chad and the National Inclusive and Sovereign Dialogue, DNIS, in 2022. What's the core insight from this example?
The core insight is how the DNIS, organized by the military regime of Muhammad Idris Deby after his father's death, was presented as a move towards stability and civilian rule, but ultimately served to consolidate dynastic power.
So a transition in name only.
Pretty much. The white paper, citing an ICG report, notes that a large majority of participants were regime loyalists. The key outcome, the postponement of elections and the allowance for Deby to run, despite violating the transition charter, demonstrates how the dialogue was used to legitimize a predetermined outcome.
Managed from the start.
Yep. The white paper quotes Enrique Pico from Human Rights Watch, who described the DNIS as transforming a military junta into a civilian regime without changing its authoritarian essence. The co-optation of former opposition members further weakened the opposition. What does this tell us about the potential for such dialogues to be genuine?
Well, it suggests that when the process is heavily controlled by the ruling power and the outcomes seem preordained, these dialogues are unlikely to lead to real democratic change. It's just going through the motions.
Exactly. What about the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo and the St. Sylvester Agreement in 2016? What's the key lesson there?
The DRC. The key lesson from the St. Sylvester Agreement, mediated by the Catholic Church, is how even agreements intended to ensure a peaceful democratic transition can be manipulated by an incumbent to prolong their rule.
So even with external mediators.
Right. Despite aiming for elections and a power-sharing arrangement after Joseph Kabila's term ended, Kabila apparently used the agreement as a pretext to stay in power for several more years, as detailed in a 2018 UN report. The eventual elections were marred by serious irregularities.
Delay tactics and manipulation.
The white paper quotes Georges Nzongo and Talaja, who argued that the agreement primarily bought social peace while preserving the regime's clientelist networks. The appointment of a moderate opposition figure as prime minister also served to divide the opposition.
Classic move. Keep the opposition fractured.
So what's the parallel the white paper draws with Mauritania based on these cases?
Well, the white paper uses these examples to highlight how dialogues in Mauritania, like those in Chad and the DRC, often serve to legitimize the existing power structure, fragment the opposition, and buy social peace without addressing the root causes of political discontent.
The same playbook, essentially.
It seems so. It then draws on Larry Diamond's concept of hybrid regimes and public choice theory to further explain these dynamics. Can you elaborate on how these theories apply?
Sure. Diamond's concept of hybrid regime seems to perfectly describe Mauritania, where you have this mix of democratic and authoritarian features regular elections, but with limited fairness, some space for opposition, but often co-opted or repressed. The selective co-optation of Tawassul, the staged nature of the national consultations, the cosmetic reforms, it all fits this model.
In public choice theory, how does that fit in?
That helps us understand the motivations. The regimes engage in these dialogues to gain international legitimacy, maybe access resources, while even some opposition figures might participate for short-term gains like positions or visibility, even if it undermines the bigger goal of democratic transition. Everyone's looking out for number one, basically.
Right. Rational actors pursuing self-interest, even within a flawed system. The white paper even includes a helpful table summarizing the Chad, DRC, and Mauritania cases, highlighting the common patterns. What's the overall conclusion drawn from these comparisons and theoretical lenses?
The author concludes that these African case studies, combined with these theoretical frameworks, support the idea of dialogued authoritarianism, where dialogues become a key tool for maintaining power.
Dialogued authoritarianism, that's a useful term.
It is. The white paper emphasizes the need for future dialogues in Mauritania to have binding guarantees, genuinely inclusive participation, and independent monitoring to be credible. Otherwise, it's just more of the same.
Essential conditions for any real progress? Now, the white paper shifts to a more direct application of theories of democracy and Mauritanian failures. What key democratic transition theories does it discuss?
Okay, so the author delves into several core theories. First, O'Donnell and Schmitter's work on democratic transitions, particularly the idea of controlled liberalizations, is used to analyze periods like the introduction of multi-partyism in 1991 and the 2005-2007 transition.
Uh-huh. Controlled liberalizations.
The white paper argues that these were top-down processes managed by the ruling elite to maintain control rather than genuine openings. The 2011 National Dialogue, with its co-optation of moderate opposition and largely symbolic reforms, also fits this tighter. What's the key characteristic of a controlled liberalization?
It's a process where the ruling regime initiates some reforms but carefully manages them to prevent a real shift in power, often incorporating elements of the opposition while maintaining ultimate control. Opening the door just a crack, but keeping the chain on.
Exactly. Next, the white paper examines Skedler's theory of competitive authoritarianism. How does that apply to Mauritania?
Shedler's theory describes regimes where elections and some forms of opposition exist, but the playing field is heavily tilted in favor of the ruling party, making truly democratic outcomes unlikely.
Sounds familiar.
Right. The white paper argues that Mauritania since 1991 fits this model well, pointing to the exclusion of opposition candidates like Biram Ould Abid in 2019 as a clear example of how the regime manipulates the electoral process.
Ah, yes, I remember that.
The author highlights Skedler's view that elections in such regimes often serve more as rituals of legitimation to gain international recognition than as genuine exercises of popular sovereignty. Finally, how does Heidmann's theory of authoritarian resilience further illuminate Mauritania's situation?
Haben's theory focuses on how authoritarian regimes adapt and survive over time. The white paper analyzes how Ghazouani's regime demonstrates this through the strategic use of political dialogues to manage dissent.
The spectacle again?
The co-optation of critical voices through various means, like apparently giving contracts to bloggers, and the implementation of reforms that appear significant but ultimately consolidate state control, such as the 2022 decentralization law. What's the core insight about these resilience strategies?
The core insight is that these regimes are not static. They actively learn and adapt to challenges, using tools like dialogue and carefully crafted reforms to maintain their grip on power in a changing political landscape. They evolve.
It's depressingly sophisticated, in a way. The white paper includes another synthesis table summarizing these theories and their application to Mauritania. What's the overarching conclusion of this theoretical analysis?
The author concludes that these theories strongly suggest Mauritania is in a state of authoritarian equilibrium rather than a genuine transition to democracy.
Equilibrium, not transition. That's key.
Exactly. The dialogues, elections, and reforms are all part of a strategy to neutralize opposition, gain international legitimacy, and maintain the economic benefits that accrue to the ruling elite. The white paper suggests that breaking this cycle will require efforts outside the state's control, led by independent actors and marginalized populations.
So change from below, not from these elite packs.
That's the implication. Now, let's consider demography and structural inequalities, the breeding ground for political crises. How do these factors relate to the effectiveness and sincerity of political dialogue?
Well, the white paper highlights Mauritania's young and growing population, with a huge portion under 25, facing really high unemployment and limited economic opportunities, especially in rural areas.
A classic recipe for unrest.
Indeed, despite some economic growth, poverty and income inequality remain significant, with deep historical inequalities affecting groups like Haratines and Afro-Mauritanians in terms of land ownership and political representation.
These structural issues are crucial.
And the rentier economic system, where wealth is concentrated through control of natural resources, just makes these inequalities worse. How do these structural issues impact the potential for genuine dialogue?
It seems these deep-seated inequalities and the exclusion of large segments of the population create a context where official dialogues, often dominated by the ruling elite and co-opted opposition, just fail to address the fundamental grievances of marginalized groups.
They're talking past each other, or rather, not talking to certain groups at all.
Exactly. This can lead to cynicism, apathy, and even radicalization among those who feel their voices aren't being heard. The white paper points to low youth participation in elections and reported instances of radicalization as potential consequences. And the focus on security spending over social development in the national budget further reinforces the sense of exclusion. People see where the money's going.
Right. Now let's discuss rentier economy and clientelism, the hidden springs of power. How do these factors influence the nature of political dialogue in Mauritania?
Okay, so the white paper argues that Mauritania's rentier economy, heavily reliant on things like mining and fishing, and the pervasive system of clientelism are fundamental factors undermining genuine political dialogue.
The resource curse, basically.
In many ways, yes. The control over vast wealth generated from mining and fishing is concentrated in the hands of a select elite, fostering crony capitalism through non-transparent deals. How do official dialogues often function within this context?
According to the white paper, these dialogues can become platforms for exchanging political loyalty for access to state resources, like a marketplace.
A political marketplace, yeah.
We see examples of opposition figures being brought into government with relatively powerless positions and contracts being awarded to companies connected to the ruling party. Regional dialogues can also be used to co-opt local leaders through the distribution of land and mining concessions.
Buying loyalty.
This system, as explained by public choice theory, prioritizes the self-interest of political actors over the broader public good. What are the long-term consequences of this rentier model and clientelism?
The white paper argues that it traps Mauritania in a cycle of dependence on resource rents, exacerbates inequality, and stifles innovation. There's less incentive for genuine economic diversification and development when the ruling elite can maintain power through control of these resources and patronage networks.
Why build a real economy when you can just distribute rents?
Precisely. This also reduces the regime's need for genuine accountability to the population. The white paper then turns to strategies for the citizen, from resignation to informed action. Given this analysis, what actions does the author suggest citizens can take?
Okay, so the author emphasizes nonviolent strategies, starting with critical disengagement, basically, boycotting what are seen as rigged elections to avoid legitimizing the system. Don't play a rigged game.
Makes sense.
The white paper introduces Roll's concept of civil disobedience and gives examples of citizen-led protests against electoral manipulation. What other strategies are proposed?
Well, the white paper highlights the importance of building cross-cutting alliances across different social groups, drawing inspiration from movements like Y'en a marre in Senegal, and leveraging social media to connect diverse voices around shared demands. Strength in numbers across divides.
That sounds promising.
It also discusses the strategic use of law through international and regional legal mechanisms to expose human rights abuses, using the system against itself, in a way. Finally, the author stresses the crucial role of political education, referencing Paulo Freire's work on empowering the oppressed through critical awareness and providing examples of grassroots education initiatives aimed at fostering political literacy. Knowing your rights, understanding the system.
Yeah, knowledge is power.
Yeah.
The white paper includes a table summarizing these strategies. What's the overall message of this section for the Mauritanian citizen?
The core message is one of empowerment through collective action, critical thinking, and strategic engagement. It urges citizens to move beyond resignation and actively work towards genuine change through various nonviolent means. Don't just wait for change, make it.
Right. Finally, the white paper presents institutional proposals, paths to democratic renewal. What key reforms are suggested?
Two main institutional reforms are proposed. First, a shift to a full proportional representation electoral system, modeled on South Africa, to ensure fairer representation for all political and ethnic groups and reduce the dominance of the ruling party.
Proportional representation. That would be a big shift.
Huge. This would involve a single national list, a lower electoral threshold, and gender quotas. The white paper also outlines necessary conditions for this reform, like constitutional revision with international oversight and an independent electoral commission. You need the infrastructure for it to work.
Okay, what's the second proposal?
The second major proposal is for transitional justice, drawing on the Moroccan Equity and Reconciliation Commission as a model to address past human rights abuses, including slavery and ethnic massacres, and to tackle systemic corruption.
Dealing with the past to build the future.
Exactly. Through a special hybrid tribunal with both national and international judges. The white paper discusses the lessons learned from the Moroccan experience, both positive and negative, and suggests ways to strengthen such a mechanism in Mauritania.
So, learning from others' experiences, there's a final table summarizing these proposals. What's the concluding thought in this final chapter?
The author concludes by emphasizing that these institutional reforms, based on successful models elsewhere, are essential steps towards a genuine democratic transition in Mauritania. Quoting Nelson Mandela, the white paper stresses the importance of addressing past injustices.
Can't just sweep it under the rug.
Nope. The roadmap involves implementing these reforms, requiring sustained citizen pressure and the support of international partners. It won't happen on its own.
Okay, so to bring it all together, after this deep dive into ELY Mustapha's white paper, what's the central conclusion about the dialogues proposed by the Mauritanian authorities?
The central conclusion is quite clear. Based on the historical patterns, the comparisons with other African nations, and the application of various political theories, the white paper strongly argues that these dialogues are not genuine attempts at democratic reform.
Yeah.
Instead, they appear to be a recurring strategy used by authoritarian regimes in Mauritania to maintain power, manage dissent, and gain both internal and international legitimacy without enacting fundamental changes. It's a tool of control.
Right, a well-honed tool, it seems.
And for you, the listener, who sought a deeper understanding of this complex issue, we hope this analysis has provided valuable insights into the dynamics at play.
Indeed. It leaves us with a final thought. Perhaps the real path to a more just and democratic Mauritania lies not in waiting for these top-down dialogue spectacles to deliver change, but in fostering a new kind of dialogue from the ground up, one that is truly inclusive, empowers marginalized voices, and demands genuine accountability from those in power. Consider how this dynamic of potentially insincere dialogue might be present in other political contexts you're familiar with around the world.
Food for thought.